In August of 2017, I saw a full solar eclipse. It was wild the way this whole thing worked. I mean, the eclipse was wild, but the alignment, which normally would just be moon and sun and wherever you're standing on Earth, for me was even more multifaceted alignment because the path of that total eclipse was right through Lander, Wyoming, where I lived at the time, where I'd lived for a long time. And this is crazy, it just so happened that the International Space Station was going to traverse that eclipse where I lived. And it just so happened that I was great friends and still am with a buddy of mine named Destin, who has a YouTube channel called Smarter Every Day. And he was going to make a video trying to get a shot from Earth with a regular camera of the International Space Station running right through the path of an eclipse. So it's this insane alignment for me geographically, in terms of time, in terms of this friendship. And so my buddy Destin and his family came up and we all went to just the right spot to set everything up. We had some other friends out there with us and we had all our cameras ready, and Destin forgot to take the filters off of a couple of them. So fortunately we had a lot of redundancies and we had all this prep and all this excitement and everything. But when the sun actually went away, and when we got to the point where we had, I don't know what you call it, there's some term for it, but it's like horizon dawn all the way around. It looked like dawn was happening from every corner of the earth where we were sitting out here in Wyoming. When it got to that point, you could just hear people from, I mean, miles away just screaming and cheering, and there was this weird eerie euphoria that swept over our families and our group. Is like one of the most stable, predictable things, maybe the most stable, predictable, physical thing that makes the rhythms of life happen, that indeed we measure the passage of time by. It went away and it got disrupted for a minute. Now look, we live in the age of science. I'm out there with a brilliant scientific mind and my buddy Destin. And so I get it. I understood what was going on. I understood the principles. But between the incredible, almost providential level intersections that were happening socially and geographically in my life at that moment, and the obvious physical phenomenon that was occurring in front of me, it was just a very, very moving experience. And we filmed it. So if you want, I mean, just go over to the Smarter Everyday channel. Maybe Jeff will remember to give you a link down there. Destin and I both made videos on our channels trying to capture the magic of that moment, so you can check it out if you want to. But the point is, it was super memorable. And when the sun gets disrupted, even in the age of science, it feels like it means something. I certainly applied meaning to it because of those other factors that were present. And unsurprisingly, the classical world and the ancients from way back in the day, they assigned meaning to the absence of light caused by eclipses. Now, it is very common to just assume that people back then were all rubish idiots who just banged rocks on strips of hardened leather and walked around in fur tunics and grunted at each other. So that's not the case. This is a very sophisticated time in history. People knew stuff in the classical world. They understood what was going on. They knew what eclipses were. But, and here's another thing that we have in common as humanity across the centuries, it was pretty exciting and pretty moving and pretty memorable for them as it is for us today. We get an unscheduled eclipse in Matthew 27. This is weird, and I think it's a detail that is often overlooked in this whole crucifixion story, but it goes like this. Very simply, in verse 46, Matthew notes, "From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over all the land." Why is Matthew giving us this detail? Well, I think one reason is really obvious, because it happened, and that would have been very memorable. And maybe people who are like, what day was that again? It was like a Friday or something. Yeah, I think I remember Passover that year. And that weird thing that happened with the light in the afternoon. Oh, you mean the eclipse? No, it wasn't an eclipse. It just got dark all around Jerusalem for a few hours. Oh, you mean like a sandstorm? Well, not exactly. We've seen that before. It was just a strange darkness. And maybe Matthew's including this detail to just help people who would have been alive for these events to connect the dots and be like, huh, yeah, that does stand out to me. And maybe it's just meant to help them feel more connected to an event that they were around for and that they were alive for. But I think even more so, what Matthew is doing here is tapping back into some stuff that would have been a part of the story that everybody knew in his original audience, that being the story of the Old Testament. Now, darkness was one of the plagues in Egypt. And so the Hebrew people would have known that this is a tool that God has at his disposal, and it can be a tool that God deploys when he is expressing displeasure with the government or a king or a ruler who has made a wrong decision toward his sons and daughters, his chosen people, his children. Maybe there's that point of connection, but much more strongly there's the point of connection with the book of Amos. Amos was a Judean, so he was alive when the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah were separated out. So after the big collapse, the big falling out that happened there. And when Amos is writing in the mid-700s BC, Israel, the northern kingdom, was super idolatrous. They're a total mess. Their culture is falling apart, but to the outside, it looks like all the economic indicators are great. They're in pretty good stead with all of the major powers that could hurt them, even though we would see that the wheels are going to come off of that very shortly after Amos wrote. At the same time, when Amos is writing, the southern kingdom of Judah is not quite in as powerful a position, and the leadership there is maybe in a little better shape morally, I suppose, but culturally, the southern kingdom is taking their cues at this point in history from the northern kingdom. And maybe you have lived through an era at some point in your life, whether you are young or old, in whatever country or whatever culture you live in, where you look at it and you're like, that was a dark era socially. You couldn't just pin it on some lady or some dude or one movie or one particularly bad cultural habit. Like, the whole thing was just off. People thought dumb things. They did dumb things. And the world was stupid and seemed like it was heading off of a cliff for a little while. If you have ever lived through that, or if you can imagine that, then you can picture the world that Amos seems to be describing, or that the dialogue between Amos and God, as it is presented in the book of Amos, seems to be characterizing. Now, the book of Amos opens with a whole bunch of woe to you, God's judgment is heading your way statements toward pretty much everybody in the ancient Near East. They all get a turn. What do we got here? Damascus, so that's Syria, Assyria. Philistia, so that's, this is like Gath and where Goliath is from. Edom, Tyre, that's the Phoenicians. Moab, Ammon. And even Judah, the southern kingdom, gets a little paragraph about matching in length with all those other nations and kingdoms I just mentioned, that all starts with the same structure: for 3 sins of whoever you are, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath, because, and it kind of reads like the letters to the churches at the beginning of the book of Revelation at the very end of the Bible, where it's like, all right, this maybe this went well, but for the most part, those churches also all get here's what's not going well. And it's a promise of judgment. So we get done with all of that, including one for Judah, and they're all the same length. And then the rest of the book is more or less about Israel. And it's a pretty big book. Like, what do we got here? 9 chapters. And God just unloads with both barrels on the culture and the social standards and the moral beyond a slippery slope, like vertical 90-degree drop that is happening culturally here. He's detailed. He's very specific. He talks about the judgments that are going to happen. He talks about why it's screwed up. He cuts all the way to the level of what's wrong with their hearts. He calls them depraved. It is very intense Bible. And then you get into chapter 8. Well, really before chapter 8, it starts to pivot into like, hey, here's what's going to go down. And this is predictive of what ultimately would be the fate, the deciding event for the northern kingdom, and that is the invasion of Assyria, a giant tiger that Israel had flirted with and then fought against and squabbled with and not totally kept its promises with. And Assyria, you do not mess around with them in the 7th century, or rather 8th century BC. These were the big dogs. These were the mean ones. They were not nice. They did things with your severed heads after they killed you, that kind of people. And the prophet Amos indicates that now there's a judgment coming, and it looks like, hint, hint, it's coming from Assyria. And indeed, in chapter 8, there's a specific prediction about what is going to happen because of the faithless leadership of the people of Israel and how they have wandered from God and parted ways with God's plan for what the kingdom should look like and what his values are. And it goes like this: "In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight." And then he goes on to describe a bunch of other stuff about this ruin that would occur. Now, it looks like Amos was drawing on an actual eclipse that had occurred in that area to create some visuals, some imagery about what this darkness that is going to descend is like, the feeling of that, although instead of being an astronomical phenomenon here, this is going to be the actual judgment of God. Now, again, probably people had some understanding of what this was all the way back in the 8th century. We know people knew what eclipses were back then. Just, did everybody know? I can't really speak to that. And of course, one of the useful things when we dig into ancient history is that we know when all the eclipses were. We can project that back out and align it to all the sources we have. It's actually a really helpful dating method. But all of that to say, we were talking yesterday about all of these payoffs that are happening in Matthew, where Matthew doesn't bother to spell it out or say, like, just like this prophet or that prophet said. Well, here's another one. This darkness thing is, as we discussed, just a way to be like, hey, remember that thing that happened, that weird darkness? Yeah, it was connected to this. It's a way to connect the dots for his original audience. But at the much deeper level, in a Matthean stylistic sense, he's using this darkness that occurred to pay off Old Testament stuff, to be evocative of what happened with the plagues in Egypt back in Exodus, and to be evocative of the minor prophet Amos's declaration of judgment from God against the northern kingdom of Israel that would ultimately be delivered at the hands of the Assyrians. In a way that's not as subtle as it might seem to you and me, he is saying to the original audience that all these people who we just listed, all of them, all the different religious leaders, these Gentiles, everybody who is participating in what's happening to Jesus right now, yeah, you're kind of like those wicked northern kings of Israel. You're kind of like Pharaoh. You are on the wrong side of this equation. And there was a big visual hint to let everybody know. Important note. This also seems to mark the moment in the crucifixion account where the tone starts to shift. The first seeds of doubt in the mind of the onlookers that they might have got this wrong starts to creep in here with this whole darkness thing. More on that and the timeline that goes along with it next time around. We got a bonus episode tomorrow, so if you happen to be about and have a little extra time this weekend, make sure to grab that one. And we're going to have Jeff on, and we're going to talk about some of the music stuff we do. I think it'll be fun. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.